She had 6 children, an empty purse, and nowhere left to go. And the only man who offered help was a stranger nobody in town trusted. That was the day Evelyn Carter arrived in Blackwater Ridge, not with hope, not with a plan, but with the last of everything she had left. 6 boys, a limping mule, a wagon held together by wire and desperation, and a heart so thoroughly broken by years of disappointment that she had stopped allowing herself to want anything she could not carry on her back. The sky that morning was the color of old pewter. The wind came down from the northern hills cold and purposeful, cutting through every layer of clothing like it had been waiting specifically for them. The mule, a gray, hollow-flanked animal named Clover, dragged her left foreleg with every step. Evelyn felt it. She felt everything. But feeling something and being able to fix it were 2 entirely different things, and she had learned that lesson so many times it no longer surprised her. Benji, the youngest, slept against her chest. He was 4 years old and had spent more of his life moving from place to place than staying anywhere long enough to call it home. His small fist was curled around the edge of her coat, tight, instinctive, the grip of a child who had learned in his bones that the world shifted without warning. Samuel walked beside the wagon rather than riding it. He had started doing that 3 towns ago when he first noticed the wheel wobbling. He never mentioned it, he never asked for recognition. He simply climbed down and walked so the wagon would carry less weight. He was 14 years old and already carried the particular heaviness of a boy who had learned too early that somebody had to be responsible, and that somebody was usually him. Noah walked with his eyes on the distant hills, always measuring distances that nobody else thought to measure. Eli kept his hands in his pockets and his gaze on the wagon's undercarriage, mentally listing what needed fixing and in what order. The twins, Micah and Levi, moved alongside each other in low, endless conversation, 10 years old and possessed of an almost miraculous ability to find something worth laughing about in circumstances that warranted none. Evelyn watched all of them, and she felt the specific, bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who has held a family together through sheer force of will for so long that she has forgotten what it felt like before the holding began, before the counting of coins, before the calculating of exits, before the years of learning to read the tone of a man's voice before his face told her anything. She pulled Clover to a stop in front of the land office. There was a notice tacked to the board outside, and she had learned, through too many desperate towns and too many closed doors, that notices sometimes contained possibilities. She read it once. Then she read it again, more slowly, the way you read something you want to believe but are afraid to. A ranch outside town, a cabin, water access, pasture land, available for temporary work arrangement and upkeep while the estate remained in legal dispute. She stood there turning those words over in her mind the way she turned the last coin in her coat pocket, carefully, repeatedly, afraid to spend it. She could not afford it. She knew that before she finished reading. Whatever arrangement they wanted, she had nothing to offer except labor, and the fierce, unrelenting capability of a woman who had kept 6 children alive through 2 brutal winters and 100 small catastrophes that nobody ever wrote down and nobody ever would. She did not notice the man watching her from across the street. Nathan Hale had come to Blackwater Ridge for 3 things: flour, salt, a replacement harness buckle. He had already completed all 3 and was riding out when something stopped him at the far edge of the street. He was not sure afterward what made him look, but he looked. And he saw a woman standing at an auction board with 6 children arranged around her like a small, exhausted army, reading a notice with the expression of someone doing impossible mathematics in their head, trying to figure out how to make something work that, by every reasonable measure, could not work. He knew that expression. He had warned it himself, long ago, in a different kind of wilderness than this one. Nathan had come back from the war missing things that had no names and could not be seen. The man he had been before, easy with laughter, full of plans, certain the future held something worth moving toward, had not made the return journey with him. What came back instead was quieter, harder, more careful. He had been engaged once to a woman named Margaret before the war swallowed everything. She had not waited. He did not blame her. He had simply taken that loss and added it to the others and built around all of it the life he now lived. 40 isolated acres, honest labor, the company of horses and open sky, and silence that asked nothing of him. That silence had suited him for years. He turned his horse and rode 2 miles down the road toward home. Then he stopped. He sat in the saddle in the middle of the empty road while the wind moved dry grass around him in long, slow waves. He thought about the set of her shoulders, the way she had not allowed herself to slump, even though every line of her body said she was being held upright by determination alone. The youngest child asleep against her chest. The oldest boy walking beside the wagon so it would carry less weight. He thought about that boy for a long time, because he recognized something in that boy that had no name either. Nathan turned his horse around and rode back into Blackwater Ridge. He told himself it was a practical decision. The ranch needed upkeep. There was a cabin sitting empty and developing the problems that empty cabins always develop. He needed someone who could work. These justifications were reasonable. They were also only partly true. He dismounted at a respectful distance and stood quietly until Evelyn looked up. Her eyes, when they found him, were not afraid. They were measuring, assessing. There was a difference, and Nathan felt it immediately. She was not frightened of him. She was calculating precisely how much danger he represented and what her options were if the answer was any. He took his hat off. "I own the Hale property, the one listed on that board. I put the notice up myself." She said nothing. She waited. "I'm not looking for rent. I'm looking for someone who knows how to work. The cabin needs repair. The garden needs tending. There's a smokehouse leaking since September and a fence line that needs 2 more weeks of labor before winter comes in serious." Evelyn looked at him, then at her boys, then back at him. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Her voice was level and careful and gave away nothing. It was a fair question. Nathan did not have a clean answer for it. "Because you've read that notice 4 times, he said, "and you're still standing here." She studied him the way a person studies the sky before deciding whether to trust it with their plans. Then quietly, she said, "I have 6 sons." "I can count," Nathan said. Something shifted in her expression. Not warmth, not yet, but perhaps the first faint loosening of the absolute certainty that this too would turn into something she would have to survive. "The cabin has 2 rooms. It's tight, but it's solid. Water from the creek behind the property. If the work is done right, the arrangement continues through spring." He put his hat back on. "Road out of town heads north. Ranch is 4 miles past the second ridge. Gates unlocked." He rode away before she could find a reason to say no. She stood there for a long moment after he left. Samuel came and stood beside her. He read the notice, then he looked at the direction Nathan had ridden and then at his mother's face. "What do you think?" she asked him. She rarely asked, but she was so tired. Samuel was quiet for a moment. "I think Clover can't make another 20 miles, he said finally, "and I think that wheel's going to give before morning." It was not a yes, but it was not a no. Evelyn looked down at Benji sleeping against her chest. She looked at each of her boys, Noah, Eli, Micah, Levi, Samuel, and then she looked at the road heading north. She clicked her tongue softly at Clover. The wagon groaned forward. The ranch was exactly what had been promised and nothing more. The cabin was small and weathered and smelled of wood smoke and old silence. The smokehouse leaned slightly east with gaps in the boards that the wind discovered immediately and spoke through. The pasture land beyond the fence line rolled away in every direction beneath a sky that felt enormous and indifferent out here, miles from town, miles from anything. Nathan was splitting firewood when they arrived. He stopped. He nodded once in their direction. Then he went back to work. No speeches, no tour, no performance of generosity. He simply pointed, when Samuel asked, to where the well stood, where the tool shed was, where the horses were kept. Then he left them to settle themselves while he finished what he was doing. That night, Evelyn lay awake in the dark cabin listening to her boys breathe around her. She stared at the ceiling and ran through every way this could go wrong. She had always kept that list. It was how she had survived, knowing every exit before she needed it, reading every situation before it turned. She had learned that skill the hard way. Her husband, Thomas, had been a charming man when she married him, funny and warm and full of plans. But plans had a way of becoming excuses, and excuses had a way of becoming something uglier. And by the time she understood who he really was, she already had 4 children and no money of her own and nowhere to go. He died of fever 2 years later and left her with debt, a 5th child on the way, and the particular freedom that comes from having nothing left to lose. She had been running ever since. Not from grief, from the consequences of trusting too easily. She lay in the dark of Nathan Hale's empty cabin, and she promised herself what she always promised herself. She would work honestly, she would stay only as long as it served her children. She would not need anything from this man that she could not provide herself. She would not make the same mistake again. Outside the window, the Montana sky was enormous and full of cold stars. She closed her eyes. And in the morning, the water bucket beside the cabin door was already full. She had not filled it. She stood looking at that bucket for a long, quiet moment while the pale morning light came over the eastern ridge. Then she picked it up and went inside to start the fire. The weeks that followed were hard in the way that honest work is hard, demanding and exhausting, and underneath all of it, quietly, stubbornly satisfying. Evelyn attacked the garden like she had a score to settle with it. She repaired what she could in the smokehouse and organized the larder with a thoroughness and precision that Nathan noticed without commenting on. She rose before the boys and went to sleep after them, and in between she worked with the focused energy of a woman who understood that labor was the one currency she still had in abundance. The boys found their places gradually, naturally, the way children do when given enough space to breathe. Eli spent a full afternoon studying the broken wagon wheel, turning the problem over in his mind the way he turned every mechanical problem, patiently, thoroughly, from every angle. Then, without announcing it, he simply fixed it. Nathan watched from the barn doorway and said nothing, but the next morning a new set of tools appeared on the workbench that had not been there the day before. No note, no explanation, just the quiet, deliberate act of someone who had noticed what a child cared about and decided that caring was worth something. The twins found the 2 old horses in the far pasture and asked, carefully, politely, fully prepared for refusal, if they could brush them. Nathan said yes. Those horses were brushed every single day after that. Samuel watched all of this. He had spent too many months in too many places where kindness in the first week became something else entirely by the third. He watched Nathan the way a careful person watches weather, not with fear exactly, but with the patient vigilance of someone who has learned that conditions always change eventually. But Nathan did not change. He was the same man on a difficult day as on an easy one, the same steadiness, the same quiet, the same unhurried way of moving through the world. He never raised his voice. He never made anyone feel small. One afternoon, Micah knocked an entire jar of preserved peaches off the shelf. It hit the floor and shattered, and the sound of it made Micah go completely still. He stood there in the silence that followed, waiting. His small body had learned through hard experience what often came after sounds like that. He was braced for it. Every muscle in him was ready. Nathan looked at the mess on the floor. He looked at Micah. "Grab the mop," he said simply, and turned back to what he was doing. Micah grabbed the mop. and something deep in his chest, something that had been wound tight for a very long time, came quietly, carefully loose. Samuel saw it happen from across the room. He said nothing, but that night at supper, he sat with his back to the door for the first time Evelyn could remember. She noticed. She looked down at her plate and said nothing, and was grateful for the low light so nobody could see her face. Winter came to Montana territory without warning and without mercy. The temperature fell 40 degrees in 2 days. Snow arrived sideways on a wind that shook the cabin walls and packed the doorway and turned the world outside into a white, featureless silence. The days shortened to almost nothing. The nights stretched long and cold and dark. But inside the cabin, it was warm. There was always wood, always enough to eat. The boys were loud in the evenings, arguing, laughing, spilling things, asking questions, and the sound of them filled every corner of a house that had been silent for 2 full seasons before they arrived. Evelyn noticed, somewhere in the middle of December, that she had stopped calculating how quickly she could pack if she needed to. She noticed this the way you notice something that has been gone for a while, with a start, and then a strange, uncertain feeling in your chest, like standing at the edge of something you cannot see the bottom of. She did not trust it. Hope had shown her its teeth before. Then came the night. Benji got sick. It started with warmth in his cheeks that could have been firelight, a quietness that could have been the end of a long day. But by midnight, his fever was climbing fast, and Evelyn knew, in the wordless, absolute way that mothers know things, that this was something serious. She sat beside him and pressed a cool cloth to his forehead and felt the fear moving through her in long, cold waves. Because she had been here before. Not in this cabin, not in this territory, but in a winter very much like this one, in a town she could not remember the name of anymore, beside a child much smaller than Benji, her daughter, Clara. Clara had lived 8 months. 8 months of small sounds and small hands and the particular, irreplaceable weight of an infant held against your chest. 8 months, and then one brutal winter night, she was simply gone. Evelyn had never spoken of Clara to anyone. She carried that loss the way you carry something that has no bottom, not in her hands, but somewhere deeper, in the place where the things you cannot say live permanently. Now she sat in the dark of a Montana winter beside her youngest son and felt that old grief rising up beneath the new terror, and she could not tell anymore where one ended and the other began. She heard the door. Nathan stood in the doorway with his boots still on. He took one look at Benji, then one look at Evelyn. He did not ask what she needed. He built the fire higher without being asked. He heated water. He brought clean cloths and changed them with a gentleness that she had not expected from those large, calloused, work-hardened hands. He sat across from her on the cabin floor, and they worked through the worst hours of the night in complete silence. A silence that was not empty, but full of something that did not need words. When Evelyn's hands began to shake, Nathan reached over quietly and took the cloth from her fingers, and did it himself. An hour passed, then another. At some point before dawn, Evelyn stopped holding herself together. It happened the way things happen after they have been held too long, not with drama, not with warning, but completely and all at once. She pressed both hands over her face and she wept. Not only for Benji, not only for Clara, but for every mile of road behind her and every night she had lain awake planning exits, and every time she had refused to need anyone, because every time she had needed anyone, it had cost her something she could not afford to lose. Nathan sat beside her on the floor and did not move away. He did not tell her it would be fine. He did not offer words of comfort or explanation or reassurance. He simply stayed, present and steady and without any demand at all. The fire crackled, the wind pressed against the cabin walls, the long Montana night continued its slow, dark work. And Nathan sat beside her in the middle of it all and let her fall apart without making her feel that falling apart was something to be ashamed of. That was the thing she would remember longest. Not that he stayed, but that he made it feel like staying was the most natural thing in the world. Benji's fever broke just before sunrise. His face went soft and peaceful, and his breathing evened out into the slow, easy rhythm of a child simply sleeping. Evelyn felt the change before she saw it, felt it release its hold on her chest all at once, like something that had been clenched for hours finally letting go. She pressed her forehead gently against his small hand. She exhaled. When she looked up, Nathan was watching her. His expression had no name she could find for it. It was not pity. It was not relief performing itself for her benefit. It was simply the quiet face of a man who had sat with someone through the worst part of a long night and was still there when the morning came. She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was completely undone and completely honest. Nathan looked at the boy, then at the fire, then at her. He gave one slow, deliberate nod. Then he rose and put more wood on the fire. And that was enough. That was more than enough. Spring arrived in Montana the way it always does, gradually and then suddenly, as though the land had been waiting for permission. The snow retreated toward the hills. The ground softened and darkened. Evelyn's garden, patient and silent beneath its frozen covering for months, pushed upward with the stubborn certainty of things that intend to live. The boys came alive with the season. The twins rode the horses across the open pasture with a freedom that made them look younger and older at the same time. Eli built a new door for the smokehouse that hung straight and closed clean and solid. Noah presented Nathan one afternoon with a detailed drawing of the entire property, every fence line measured, every boundary marked with careful, steady lines. Nathan took it, unfolded it slowly, studied it for a long, quiet moment. Then he folded it and put it carefully into his coat pocket. Noah stood a little straighter for the rest of the afternoon and pretended he did not notice that Nathan had kept it. Samuel began splitting firewood alongside Nathan one morning in the pale spring sunshine without being asked. They worked side by side through an entire hour in complete silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who had arrived without ceremony or announcement at an understanding. One morning in early April, Evelyn stood in the cabin doorway with her coffee warming both hands. She was watching Nathan repair the far fence line, his figure small and steady against the wide, pale sky. Behind her, the house was loud with life. Micah and Levi arguing about something that did not matter. Eli's tools going in the shed. Noah calling a question from upstairs. Benji singing a song he had invented himself, formless, tuneless, absolutely full of joy. Nathan paused in his work and looked up. Across the full length of that quiet April morning, their eyes met. No words, no gesture. Just a moment of recognition passing between two people who had each survived their own long winter and had somehow, without intending it, without planning it, without allowing themselves to hope for it, ended up warm. Evelyn stood in that doorway and understood something she had not understood before. She had not thought about leaving in months. She was not counting coins. She was not listening for the shift in tone that meant she needed to gather her children and go. She was standing in a doorway in April sunlight, listening to her children live their lives inside a home that had been empty when she arrived, and now was full of everything a home was ever supposed to hold. And across a field, still soft with the last of the thaw, a man who had turned his horse around and ridden back into town for no reason he could have cleanly named, looked up at her in the morning light. And she was home. Not because someone had given it to her, not because the road had finally treated her kindly, but because something had grown here, slowly, stubbornly, without permission, in a garden that had been left too long, in a cabin that had forgotten warmth. in two people who had each spent too many years believing that peace was something other people got to have. The doors settled behind her as she stepped inside. It closed with the quiet, sure sound of something that belongs exactly where it is. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Evelyn Carter did not think about what came next. She simply stood in the warmth and let herself stay. If something in this story found you, if it reached a place you had maybe stopped checking on, then you already understand what Desert Heart is for. This channel exists for the ones who kept going when going stopped making sense, for the ones who loved quietly and worked hard and asked for very little, and sometimes wondered if any of it mattered. It mattered. You are not forgotten here. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Desert Heart so you never miss a story, and come back, because every week we return to this place and we tell the stories of the people who deserved more than they were given and found a way to build something beautiful anyway. Subscribe. Stay. You belong here. This story carries genuine and lasting value on several levels. It portrays trauma with honesty and deep compassion. Evelyn's constant vigilance, her inability to accept kindness with suspicion, her habit of planning exits before she needs them. These are authentic and accurate portraits of how prolonged fear and hardship reshape a person from the inside. Viewers who have lived through similar experiences will not feel pitied. They will feel seen. And that feeling of being seen is itself a form of healing. It models quiet, healthy masculinity through Nathan Hale. He never attempts to rescue Evelyn or take control of her life or her choices. He earns trust the only way trust can genuinely be earned, through consistency, patience, and the daily accumulation of small acts that ask for nothing in return. This portrait of masculine goodness expressed through action rather than declaration is rare and deeply valuable. It shows children processing instability with real emotional nuance. Samuel's protective watchfulness, Noah's quiet curiosity, Eli's hands-on focus, Micah's braced, waiting stillness in the moment he expected punishment and did not receive it. These are not background children. They are fully human, and audiences will recognize someone they love in each of them. It carries genuine historical value, grounding viewers in the real experience of frontier life. The land struggles, the brutal winters, the isolation, the resilience required simply to survive from one season to the next in Montana territory. And, above all, it teaches the most important lesson without ever stating it directly. Healing is not a single dramatic moment. It is a slow accumulation of ordinary days in which nothing terrible happens. For anyone who has ever needed to learn or relearn that safety is something they are allowed to have, that lesson is not a small thing. It is everything.